My next guest has a fascinating resume as a former federal prosecutor. He's worked in tobacco litigation, sports litigation, defended Deep Throat after his true identity was revealed, and he's the author of the book Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and Began Today's Partisan Advocacy Journalism. He's also the host of the Mysteries of Watergate podcast. It's former federal prosecutor John O'Connor now on the Scott Sand Show. John, it's great to have you on.
Good to be with you, Scott.
John, so we're now like 13 days away from the election, less than 2 weeks before Election Day, and really it's election season with early voting everywhere. And one of the concerns I think everybody on both sides of political persuasions have right now is how secure, how reliable, how much trust and faith we can put in the election results we get that Tuesday night.
Well, yes, and I'm very concerned about it because if I had to use my crystal ball, I'd say Trump will get more votes. But just two states, which he should win, Georgia and Arizona, have absolutely legal sanction to fraud. I'll just put it very bluntly. Stacey Abrams, in a lawsuit for which Brad Raffensperger rolled over, Secretary of State there, it takes just about an act of Congress to disregard a signature in Georgia, which allows massive fraud on mail-in votes. And when you get to Arizona, there was another lawsuit where the Latin American League of Citizens got some ruling, got a stipulation, I think a consent decree, that one can vote in federal elections without proof of citizenship. And the Arizona Supreme Court said any attempts to undo that don't work. And so we can have fraudulent voting in two states, and there's nothing you can do about it. So if you're in this, if you're in the Democratic side of things and see that your fortunes are ebbing, you have the open field for cheating in those two places. And this is not anything to be taken lightly. That could mean the election right there. I mean, I'm very, very worried about it. I'm not worried about the fact that I think Trump is going to win by a small but decisive margin, but he may lose the election.
So I would be surprised if Donald Trump figures out a way to win the popular vote, but I do think he has an advantage as of today with the Electoral College, which is good for our country. But it's extremely alarming how some of these states conduct their voting process. I think we've got a pretty secure system here in the state of Ohio. I've heard Michigan does as well, although maybe not to the standards of a state like Ohio. But the fact that why is it so hard for us to require an identification to vote? I mean, we see the memes all the time of how you're required to show proof of ID if you want to buy beer or cigarettes or a lottery ticket, but apparently not to vote, which is one of the most important things you could do as a citizen.
Well, of course, the assumption in your question is, and it's a very good question, but the assumption is that there are people out there trying to be fair. I mean, I think it's just very clear. I think progressive politicians know that that they're not in good shape if there's fair voting and clean voting. There's no doubt about it. This whole project of not requiring identification and so forth favors one side of the aisle. You know, you don't find a bunch of small businessmen and regular middle class citizens out there trying to cheat. That's just not the demographics that the conservative side of things usually has. But you have years and years of progressive political machines in urban areas. And, you know, that's been a fact of life since Tammany Hall in the 1800s. Philadelphia's like that. New York's like that. Then increasingly you see the results in Milwaukee. And every place you have a blue-controlled large urban area. And I think, to credit Ohio is pretty darn good. It's still got the Midwestern values going, and I don't think you see a massive cheating in Cincinnati or Cleveland, as you might in other big cities. Well, so that's Ohio's credit.
The state of Ohio, to its credit, has made voting easy and cheating hard, and that's thanks to some of the leadership of people like Secretary of State John Husted. We're talking to former federal prosecutor John O'Connor here on the Scott Sand Show. John, to try to, and I'm going to use air quotes here, keep our elections secure, the Justice Department is sending poll watchers, district elections officers across the nation to keep an eye on poll workers. Is this good, or I think I know the answer? But what are the problems with dispatching a bunch of DOJ lawyers out to the polling sites?
Well, by definition, what they're there to do is to restrict the poll watchers. They're not there to actually do poll watching and actually keep the elections fair. They're really preventing poll workers from making the elections fair. So this is just part of the playbook. If you look at everything that the Biden-Harris administration has done, not publicized much, but they've done all kinds of things to encourage illegal voting, giving, registering, a lot of illegal immigrants that are registered to vote, and so forth. And there are a lot of government programs in which, there's money being spent to, so-called register voters. Well, that can work two ways. So these poll watchers, so to speak, are there to restrict people from getting involved in the process. So, you can imagine what happened in Detroit, for example, when all the poll watchers were sort of shooed away on spurious grounds and so forth. And even before then were prevented from looking over the shoulder of the poll workers to really do some meaningful poll watching. That was a big enough fight back then. Right now, the Biden-Harris people are afraid that poll watchers will actually be effective. Everybody forewarned is forearmed, and so there are a lot of conservative poll watchers who are going to try to make this election fair. And now the Justice Department is coming in. The inaptly named Justice Department is coming in to make sure things are not just. We used to send poll watchers out when I was in the government and I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, but we did it to make sure that the elections were fair. We weren't trying to restrict poll watching. We're trying to encourage it. It's not so today.
Usually the DOJ dispatches poll watchers to other third world countries when they're holding an election, not across the United States. In addition to these poll watchers, John, the Election Threats Task Force was created a few years ago by Attorney General Merrick Garland to address violence against election workers. Was that a widespread issue? Was there violence against election workers in 2020?
No, there wasn't. But I think once again the fear is that people won't be able to cheat as the poll workers. For instance, there's some really sketchy things going on in places like Detroit. And, Garland wants to protect those people who were cheating. That's all there is to it. That just put it very bluntly. That's what's going on. And you think about it, that's how low things have gotten when you have an attorney general that's trying to, encourage cheating. And that's just very, very bluntly, that's what's going on.
So what recourse would the Trump campaign, the Mike Rogers for Senate campaign in Michigan, Bernie Moreno's campaign in Ohio, have against the DOJ? I know that the Republican Party has hired a literal army of lawyers to send across the country as well to be poll watchers and to be ready for any necessary litigation following the election, following the counts. Is there recourse if one of these partisan lawyers for either party sees the DOJ intervening in a way that they shouldn't?
Well, that's a real good question because normally states have control over their own elections. And there's an increasing, ironically, there's an increasing need for federal intervention, I think, and to have federal standards, but not this type of intervention. In other words, what we should have standards throughout the country in federal elections, at least, that to make sure things are done fairly. We should have that. Even though each state may have its own rules, we should at least make sure that things are done fairly. But counterintuitively, what's going on here is that the feds are coming in to try to do just the opposite, and that's the problem. It isn't so much that there's anything wrong with the feds coming in. The real problem is what they're really aiming to do. So it's just a mess. It really is a mess. Wisconsin should have different rules than, say, Ohio, but all of the rules should be enforced fairly, and we shouldn't have cheating, and there should be some minimum standards against stuffing ballot boxes.
And that's
but
the
we
argument.
don't have that.
The argument.
That's the argument.
There should not be federalized elections, but there should be some standards across the board. We're talking to former federal prosecutor John O'Connor. You can find him at joclaw.com. He's also authors of the books The Mysteries of Watergate, What Really Happened, and Postgate. And you've got a terrific podcast. I've got to ask you your involvement with Watergate, which is a piece of American history that fascinates me.
Well, yeah, back when I was an assistant U.S. attorney in San Francisco, a young prosecutor in 1974 when Woodward and Bernstein's book came out about Deep Throat. I was interested in Watergate. I was a white-collar prosecutor. I was interested in the whole thing. So I made it my mission to figure out who Deep Throat was. And within the next year, as I thought about it, drank a lot of coffee and beer trying to figure it out. And lo and behold, I figured out it was Mark Felt, number 2 man in the FBI. Now, lo and behold, 30 years later, I don't think much about it. I meet a girl, get married, raise kids, start a law practice, don't think much about Deep Throat. And I'm sitting at the same table I'm sitting at now talking to you, Scott, and my daughter's good friend across the table mentions that his granddad was with the FBI. I asked his name. He said, Mark Felt. I said, your granddad's Deep Throat. Did you know that? Let me come up and talk to him. And he was his granddad had always denied it, but I started going up and talking to him and trying to get him to A, admit he was Deep Throat, B, then decide to come out and tell his story. And that was a process that took me 3 years. But we had a lot of fun doing it, and it was a very interesting thing. But so I talked him into coming out, and then later on wrote a book with him called G-Man's Life, which I wrote in 2006 with Mark. And as part of this, because of my background as a prosecutor, my dad was a former FBI agent just for a few years. My dad's partner actually had taken over the FBI during Watergate when Mark Felt's boss got in trouble. So I'm a good friend of Bob Mueller's, and so I was very much a Justice Department kind of guy, and Mark Felt trusted me because of that. And I tried to get him to understand that people who liked law and order would like Deep Throat, understood what Deep Throat was doing, that it wasn't just a guy that was out to get Nixon. That wasn't it at all. He was trying to keep the justice system clean, sort of the same thing we're talking about regarding elections, that we ought to have, and Watergate might have been about an election because the thought was that the burglary might have had something to do with the election. And so actually Mark Felt was trying to make sure that he investigated election irregularities fairly and fully. And that's what he did. He wasn't out to get Nixon. He liked Nixon. But anyway, so I think I'm doing a service by telling everybody what Watergate was and what it wasn't. And I will tell you this, as part of my work, and your audience should read Postgate, my book Postgate, because I talk about how in the course of my work, I discovered that the Washington Post committed a journalistic deceit in covering Watergate and really tried to do in Nixon. And we've been on that road ever since for the next 50 years. The media has now decided it's good to put on a jersey and play for one side, and that's the real result of Watergate journalism.
It's fascinating stuff, John. It's great to meet you, and thank you for coming on the show. You can find out more and listen to the podcast, get the books at postgatebook.com. John O'Connor, thanks for coming on the Scott Sands Show.
Good talking to you, Scott. Take care.